Neil Diamond. August 1969. The most powerful manager in music history called with an offer worth millions. Neil listened for 11 minutes. Then he said no. No negotiation. No counteroffer. No, let me think about it. Just no. Colonel Tom Parker, the man who had built Elvis Presley's career from nothing into the most commercially successful act in American music history, was not accustomed to hearing that word from a 28-year-old songwriter who was not yet a household name. He asked if Neil understood what he was declining. Neil said he did. He asked if there was a number that would change the answer. Neil said there was not. The call ended. What happened next? Nobody in the music industry could have predicted. And nobody could have engineered it. It required only one thing, the 11-minute call and the no at the end of it. To understand what Neil Diamond walked away from that Thursday afternoon, you have to understand what Elvis needed in the summer of 1969. The King had spent most of the 1960s making movies. While the Beatles rewrote what popular music could be and Bob Dylan rewrote what it could say, Elvis had been largely absent from the creative conversation, producing a string of soundtrack albums that satisfied his contract obligations and very little else. The comeback special of 1968 had reminded the world that the voice was still there, still extraordinary. The Las Vegas residency that followed proved the live performer had not diminished. But Elvis in 1969 was an interpreter in search of material, the greatest voice of his generation needing songs worthy of what that voice could do. He had decided that the songs he needed were Neil Diamond's. The offer Colonel Parker described was not modest. Exclusive rights to Neil Diamond's output. Every song he wrote for the term of the agreement going to Elvis first. The financial terms were enough to change Neil's life in every practical sense. No more rented offices, no more gap between tour income and tour costs, no more financial uncertainty of any kind. In exchange he would write songs. Only for Elvis. Think about what you would give up to never worry about money again. Drop it in the comments, because what Neil Diamond was asked to give up was the reason everything you know about him exists. The commercial logic was genuinely compelling. Elvis's voice applied to Neil Diamond's melodic instinct and lyrical honesty would have produced records that sold at a scale neither man could individually approach. Parker was not wrong about any of it. Neil said no anyway. Not for ego. Not from professional calculation. He said no because he had arrived at an understanding about what his songs were and what they required that made the offer, however extraordinary its financial terms, genuinely impossible to accept. The songs were not compositions that could be handed to another performer and remain fully themselves. They were not commercially interchangeable units of musical product. They were the only form in which he could say certain things that needed to be said, confessions, observations, the precise rendering of feelings that had no other adequate expression. And the voice that delivered them was not separable from the songs themselves. His voice was part of what they were. Elvis's voice was extraordinary. Nobody questioned that. His ability to find the emotional truth in a lyric and deliver it with power that transcended mere technique was real and documented across 20 years of recording. He would have done something remarkable with Neil Diamond's songs. He would have made them his. That was the problem. Not because Neil couldn't bear to share credit. Because the songs required him. Required the voice that had made them and the face that would stand behind them on stage and the presence of the person who had actually needed to say the thing the song said. That directness, the sense that what you were hearing was coming straight from the person who wrote it, was not a stylistic feature. It was the mechanism by which the songs did what they did. He said no. Parker asked once more if there was a number. Neil said no once more. The call ended. In the weeks that followed, the music industry processed what Neil Diamond had done with the institutional efficiency it always brings to decisions that don't make sense in commercial terms. The calls changed. The assumptions changed. The projection of what Neil Diamond's career was going to produce over the next decade was quietly revised downward. He kept writing. He wrote Cracklin' Rosie. He wrote Songs Sung Blue. He wrote I Am I Said, in a Los Angeles hotel room, in a period of real personal difficulty, a song about the loneliness of being between where you started and where you are going with no guarantee that the distance will produce arrival. The song was not a strategy. It was the next true thing. It reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1971. The industry revised its projections upward again. And Sweet Caroline kept traveling. Not on the charts. The commercial peak was already behind it when Parker called. It traveled the way genuine songs travel. Person to person, context to context, decade to decade. It found Fenway Park. It found a baseball fandom in Boston that needed a sound for itself and found it in 3 syllables and a chorus, and made it so completely their own that many of the people who have sung it loudest have never thought about where it came from or who needed to say it first. That could only have happened because the song was Neil Diamond's. Because it bore, in its melodic structure and its lyrical directness and the quality of voice that delivered it, the mark of a single person's authentic expression. If Elvis had recorded it, and Elvis's version would have been extraordinary, it would have been Elvis's record. It would have been played on radio and loved by millions and remembered as a great Elvis track. It would not have found Boston. Finding Boston required being unmediated. Required coming from the person who needed to write it, in the voice that needed to say it, with no layer of interpretation between the song and the listener. That directness was what a community could attach themselves to. You cannot adopt someone else's interpretation. You can adopt the original. Neil kept building. The catalog grew. Hello Again, September Morn, Love on the Rocks, America. Each song finding its people through the same direct channel that the decision in August 1969 had protected. Not because they were all as commercially enormous as Sweet Caroline. Because they were all as honest. Because they all came from the same source, undistorted. Elvis died in August 1977, 8 years almost to the month after the phone call. Neil was performing in Las Vegas when the news arrived. He stopped his show. He told the audience what had happened. He said he had met Elvis once, briefly, and that Elvis had cared about songs in the way that people care about things that actually matter to them. He said nothing about what he had been offered and declined. That was not the moment for it. In an interview in 1981, an interviewer finally asked directly, did he regret saying no to Colonel Parker? Neil took a moment. Then he said, I regret a lot of decisions in my life. That one is not among them. No elaboration. No explanation of why. None was needed because by 1981 the elaboration was playing in stadiums across America, being sung by people who had never thought about Neil Diamond at all but knew every word of a song that had found them through the most direct possible route, without any intermediary between the man who wrote it and the people who needed it. The decision was correct when it was made on a Thursday afternoon in a rented Hollywood office, before any of that had happened, before Boston, before the decades of arena tours, before the Grammy and the Kennedy Center Honor and the Hall of Fame. The decision was correct because the songs were true and could only be delivered by the person who had needed to make them true. He said no. The songs remained his. And they found everyone they were going to find. One person at a time. Until the whole world knew the words. There is something worth sitting with in the nature of what Parker was actually offering, not the money but what the money was attached to. Becoming Elvis Presley's exclusive songwriter was not simply a financial arrangement. It was a complete redefinition of what Neil Diamond was. It was the conversion of a performer into a supplier. Of an artist into a craftsman whose output served someone else's voice and someone else's vision. The financial terms were extraordinary precisely because what was being purchased was extraordinary. Not a song here and there, but the entire creative output of a man who had been writing music since he was 16 years old and had no intention of stopping. Parker had identified something real. He understood that Neil Diamond's songs had a quality that Elvis needed. A directness, a warmth, a melodic accessibility that reached listeners without requiring them to meet the music halfway. He was correct that Elvis's voice could have done something remarkable with that material. What Parker had not fully accounted for was that the quality he was trying to purchase was inseparable from its source. The directness of Neil Diamond's songs came from the fact that they were confessions. They were not compositions designed to showcase a performer's range or serve a commercial purpose. They were the only available form for things that needed saying. Strip away the person who needed to say them and you don't have the same songs. You have something that resembles them. Something technically accomplished and emotionally approximate. Not the same thing. Neil understood this about his work with a clarity that is genuinely rare. Most artists spend years learning it. Some never do. He knew it at 28 in an 11-minute phone call, well before the catalog that would prove him right had been written. He knew it the way you know things that are foundational rather than learned, not because someone taught it to him but because it was simply true, in the way that structural facts about how you work are true, and ignoring them is not integrity, it is just inaccuracy. The decision was not noble. It was accurate. He was the person who had to sing the songs because he was the person the songs came from. Giving them to someone else was not generosity, it was a category error. It was asking someone else to be you, and then complaining when they turn out to be them instead. Parker never called back. The offer was not repeated. Neil Diamond returned to his desk and wrote the next song. And the one after. And the one after that. What the years after the phone call revealed, gradually and without fanfare, was that the decision had protected something more than Neil Diamond's ability to perform his own songs. It had protected the conditions under which the songs could continue to be written. This is less obvious than it sounds. A songwriter who writes exclusively for another performer is not simply in a different professional arrangement. They are in a different relationship with their own creative output. The work becomes product in a way it cannot be when the writer is also the person who will stand on stage and say these words in front of a room full of people and be personally accountable for every syllable. When Neil Diamond wrote a song, he knew he was going to sing it. He was going to have to walk out in front of human beings and say this thing and mean it. That knowledge, that accountability, was part of the creative process. It was the constraint that made the honesty necessary. You cannot perform something you do not believe in front of 10,000 people for 2 hours. You cannot maintain a lie at that volume. The songs were honest because he had to sing them. If he had accepted Parker's offer, the songs would have been written for someone else to sing. The accountability would have been Parker's. The commercial judgment would have been Parker's. The creative decisions about what was too personal, what was too exposed, what needed to be protected and what could be shared, all of those would have migrated to the person who controlled the release of the material. And Neil Diamond, freed from the requirement of standing behind his own work in public, would have had no reliable mechanism for knowing when the honesty had gone. He might not have noticed immediately. The first songs written for Elvis might have been indistinguishable from the ones he was already writing. The process of drift is rarely visible while it is happening. But the catalog, the accumulated body of work that Sweet Caroline and I Am I Said and Hello Again represent, required not just talent but the specific discipline that performing your own material imposes. The discipline of being accountable to yourself on stage, in real time, in front of people who can tell the difference between something meant and something delivered. He kept that discipline by keeping the songs, by saying no to Parker, by returning to the desk the next morning and writing the next thing that needed writing. The career that resulted is what it is. Enormous, lasting, embedded in the culture in ways that were never planned and cannot be undone. The songs are still being sung in stadiums by people who have no particular interest in Neil Diamond the person. Sweet Caroline is still playing in Fenway Park. Hello Again is still the song that people put on when they need to feel the thing it describes. That is what the 11-minute call produced. Not the no. What the no protected. The conditions under which the yes to every song that came after, could keep being true. Parker never called back. The offer was not renewed. The conversation ended where it began, in 11 minutes, with a no that was never revised. Neil Diamond went back to work. He always went back to work. That, in the end, is the whole story. Not the call. Not the money. Not the famous name on the other end of the line. The going back to work, the next morning and every morning after, with the song still his and the voice still his and the accountability still entirely, irrevocably his own.